in capitals throughout Africa. The headlines appeared nearly too properly to agree with. IMF to erase billions in African debt. Cameras flashed. Western anchors praised it as a historical remedy plan for struggling economies. It sounded like salvation, but in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré failed to clap. He clenched his fist. Behind the smiling faces and press meetings became a truth no person dared to mention aloud. The deal wasn't unfastened. It demanded collateral, not coins, not credit score, but Africa's lifeblood, gold, oil, and uranium. And the architect pulling the strings, now not the IMF's bureaucrats, however Donald Trump, his phrases recorded in private, had been blunt. If they need credit score, they have to sign their oil. If they want admire, they ought to surrender their gold. For other African leaders, the bait became tempting. Can promote debts, new loans, short relief. But for Traoré, it becomes something else, absolutely. A lure, a brand new sort of colonization dressed as kindness stay. Because what you're approximately to pay attention isn't always approximately numbers on a balance sheet. It is set how an unmarried younger leader exposed the greatest economic coup of our time, and how Africa nearly offered its destiny for the promise of freedom. The declaration landed like rain on dry ground from Washington to Brussels. The IMF paraded a historic comfort package for Africa. Partial debt cancellation, sparkling credit traces, increased disbursements. Western anchors called it mercy. African treasuries called it oxygen. Within days, ministers in several capitals signed on the dotted line, but not in Ouagadougou. Ibrahim Traoré watched the highlights in a dim briefing room, elbows at the table, eyes fixed. He had seen this choreography before. The smiling photograph ops, the speaking factors, approximately partnership, the sudden availability of dollars, right while a government was gasping for air. What stricken him wasn't the money, it became the collateral. The time period sheets were public sufficient to appear smooth and vague enough to hide teeth. Commodity-secured stabilization and resource-backed amortization sounded technical. In practice, they meant barrels of oil, tons of gold, and destiny royalty streams pledged to a person else's balance sheet, not priced in Ouagadougou or Bamako, however at benchmarks set in London and New York. Why collateralize what we already personal to cancel what we never spent? He asked quietly. A minister cleared his throat. Mr. President, they're not drawing near us without delay. They recognize your stance, exactly. Key said they are surrounding us via our buddies. In Dar, a press conference celebrated the eraser of almost $2 billion in responsibilities. In Kinshasa, officials traded copper and cobalt for balance. A coastal country signed a clause that pledged offshore crude as adjustable assurance if markets grew to become volatile. The word sounded innocent until a person realized adjustable the creditor desired. Western diplomats hosted glittering receptions, praising African leadership. The cameras loved it. The language became best. Relief, renewal, partnership. Ouagadougou did now not clap. Traoré convened a small nighttime meeting with economists, auditors, and seasoned intelligence officers. We form a unit, he said, quiet, rapid, relentless. Track the contracts, the clearing banks, the intermediaries. If this is smooth, we will see it. If it is a net, we can experience the pull. They referred to as it the Economic Investigations Unit. No fanfare, no public acronym, simply 12 human beings and a mandate, observe the money. The first sample emerged in wire instructions. Funds destined for African treasuries took long, highly priced detours through Western clearinghouses. Consulting expenses seemed like clockwork, shaved off before unmarried faculty turned into funded. Then came the valuation clauses. If gold spiked, the secured obligation increased. If oil dropped, the commodity pledge prolonged. Heads, they win. Tails, you lose. One analyst, a younger lady who had grown up in Kaya, stared at a spreadsheet. Until sunrise, they may be locking us to their rate. She said, even when we win, we lose. A week later, the unit determined emails between IMF team of workers and a private American consultancy. Subject line, Phoenix Architecture. The memo described a digital settlement layer tied to tangible commodity baskets, African oil, gold, uranium. A margin be aware study. Pilot flows can be trial via IMF programs in compliant jurisdictions. At the bottom of the associate deck, advisory DJ Trump. The room fell silent. Trump became nevertheless in workplace, and his call carried the weight of both coverage and power. For months he had teased a digital dollar of freedom in press briefings and rallies, presenting it as a patriotic guard against China's digital yuan. Now buried in technical attachments become the lacking piece, Africa's resources because the stabilizer. Without them the coin becomes simply code. With them it could be marketed as unbreakable. Traoré closed the folder and exhaled through his nostril. They learned from the closing fight. He stated no Zitzeris at ports, no loud sanctions. They will sign our brothers, then use our brothers to corner us, expose it. One advisor said, "Go public tonight." "Not yet," responded. Truth shouted, too early as brushed off his anger. Truth delivered with proof turns into judgment. He tapped the file. "We need the chain. Contracts, veers, intermediaries, the advisory tree. When we talk, we cannot pass over." Outside the continent was already dividing. Governments that signed basked in reward. Newspapers ran op-eds calling Burkina obstinate. A veteran anchor in Paris asked nearly kindly if Traoré was too young to understand the complexities of worldwide finance in markets across the Sahel. Ordinary humans didn't argue complexities. They asked why bread nevertheless priced more, why clinics nonetheless waited for medicines, why instructors' salaries nevertheless arrived past due. Relief had a funny manner of arriving everywhere except wherein it mattered. The unit pushed tougher. They mapped the consultee's purchaser listing, flagged the banks that cleared resource-backed flows, and pulled public procurement data that matched private advisory engagements. A sample sharpened the same handful of companies, designed the mortgage, counseled the valuation, processed the collateral, and drafted the PR talking points in a while, a closed loop that manufactured inevitability. One night time, the lead auditor placed a single page on Traoré's table. "This is it," he said softly. A slide titled Phoenix Dollar Commodity Stabilization Thesis, a bullet point in small font. African programs offer non-correlated anchor optics, debt alleviation, cooperation, virtual adoption, optics. True, they cancel with the left hand, chain with the proper. He stood, paced once, and stopped at the window. Ouagadougou's lighting shimmered motorbikes, market stalls. The cussed glow of a metropolis that had found out to undergo. The idea of the seized gold, the cancelled shipments, the speeches that referred to as bondage stability. "We don't need to invent a brand new currency. To combat this," he said finally, "we want to defend the handiest currency that subjects consent. If our human beings and our buddies withdraw consent their contracts D on paper how Visa asked they have got already signed we do what courts do whilst contracts are rotten. Responded we display the fraud, we display the war, we show the cause, then we ask the best jury that topics, the African public to render a verdict." He grew to become lower back to the group put together. The case no longer a speech, a case clauses is wires, names, dates, signatures, and one more component, translate everything. Every village should be capable of study what changed into done in its call. In neighboring capitals, the smiles started to stiffen. Opposition figures smelled blood. Activists asked copies of the time period sheets. Some ministers, all of a sudden shy, insisted they hadn't read the fine print. The IMF issued a calming statement approximately misunderstandings in media narratives in Ouagadougou. The president rehearsed the unmarried line for the cope with he knew he must deliver. They call it alleviation. Read with me and inform me if this seems like freedom. The square turned into packed before dawn. Farmers with dusty hats, students with notebooks, miners still of their workflow. Loudspeakers were strung between lampposts and radios across the UISDA, tuned in. Everyone knew the president had promised to talk no longer of desire but of proof. Traoré walked onto the stage wearing a folder, not a script. His voice cut through the humid air. "They name it debt alleviation, but what's comfort that needs our gold? What is freedom that chains our oil? Today I will no longer come up with slogans. I will provide you with contracts." He read clause after clause. Collateral in uranium, adjustable valuation rights, consultation charges siphoned before useful resource, reached a unmarried college. Then he held up the slide. His investigators had uncovered Phoenix Greenback Commodity Stabilization Thesis. Trump's name at the advisory line. The crowd gasped. "They aren't canceling debts," said voice rising. "They are drafting a brand new forex built on our backs. They want Africa's gold, oil, and uranium to anchor their virtual greenback. They call it innovation. I name it a coup without infantrymen." For a moment there has been silence heavy as stone. Then came the roar. Chants erupted. Cancel the contracts. Cancel the chains. The broadcast went viral throughout the continent. In Bamako, college students replayed the clip on giant monitors. In Naomi, miners marched with placards. Our uranium is not your guarantee. Even in capitals in which governments had signed IMF deals. Competition parties seized on the revelations. Parliament flooring was battlegrounds. Ministers stammered underneath, wondering. One shouted again, We did no longer know, however few believed it. Western media scrambled. Spokespeople referred to as Traor's documents selective leaks and misinterpretations. The IMF issued a denial. The Phoenix undertaking is unrelated to debt alleviation packages. Yet the files circulated online. Translated into French, Arabic, Swahili, Hoa. Ordinary human beings examined the clauses themselves. They didn't want pundits to provide an explanation for. Trump never received to stay silent. Went on television. This young man in Burkina Faso, he doesn't apprehend finance. He should thank us. Without America, Africa is Nwanti. But the soundbite backfired throughout African radio stations. Callers repeated his words with anger. They want us to thank them for stealing from us. The IMF doubled down with stress. Contracts had been tightened. Disbursements delayed. Grain shipments sure for Africa were mysteriously inspected at European ports. Insurance for Sahel exports skyrocketed in a single day. Markets trembled. Fear turned into the weapon now. But fear met resistance. In Ouagadougou, neighborhood organizations shaped vigilance committees to music rumors and disclosed provocateurs. Students ran social media money owed debunking IMF talking factors line through line. Spread gold is not collateral. Africa Unchained radio hosts read settlement clauses allowed inviting listeners to judge for themselves in Dar. Protests forced the authorities to suspend its IMF agreement pending review in Kinshasa. Opposition parties demanded contracts be annulled. What commenced as one speech in Burkina Faso became turning into a continental reckoning in the IMF. Frustration boiled. We underestimated him. One respectable admitted in a leaked call. He's grew to become the narrative. What was debt remedy is now colonialism. In the general public thoughts, traders behind the Phoenix dollar grew restless. Without African commodities, the project had no anchor. Without the challenge, Trump's promise of a digital dollar to rival China's yuan risked collapse. In Washington, Trump advised escalation. He demanded allies, tighten the noose, sanctions, asset freezes, diplomatic isolation, damage him earlier than others follow. He barked. Yet each pass most effective bolstered the tale Traoré had informed that this was now not comfort, however ransom for Burkina Faso. The days grew harder. Red strains lengthened, fill expenses climbed, families rationed grain, schools cut hours. Yet even in hassle, the people stood corporation. Better hungry and unfastened, a girl told a reporter, then fed with chains. Traoré remained resolute. In cupboard, he declared, they can stop our ships. They can block our loans, however they cannot cancel our truth, and reality is more effective than their contracts. The IMF had launched what a concept become in stylish coup, but coups rely upon silence and surprise. Traoré had shattered both. Africa became conscious, and awakening became the one situation the IMF had never priced in. The tide had turned. What started as murmurs in pupil halls and mining camps turned into now a wave sweeping the continent. Governments that had rushed to signal IMF contracts determined themselves cornered with the aid of their very own citizens. Protests erupted outdoor parliaments. Crowds keeping printouts of clauses. Traor's crew had uncovered risk thundered across capitals. Cancel the contracts. Cancel the chains. In Dar, lawmakers confronted an extraordinary riot. Opposition leaders brandished copies of the Phoenix dollar memos in Parliament's stressful solutions. One minister tried to protect the settlement as a transient necessity. However, the chamber drowned in boos. Days later, Senegal introduced it was postponing IMF compliance pending further evaluate, Kinshasa observed. After weeks of road demonstrations, the government iced up its collateral commitments. Similar announcements rippled through smaller states. Contracts as soon as hailed as historical remedy now seemed radioactive. No baby kisser desired to be remembered as the only who bought oil or gold to finance Trump's dream coin. For the IMF, it turned into a nightmare unraveling in real time. Officials convened emergency periods, drafting statements approximately miscommunication. However, every denial simplest fueled suspicion in leaked minds from a Brussels meeting. One European banker admitted, the Africans have caught us. If extra contracts fall apart, the entire structure falls. Meanwhile, Trump raged at rallies. He accused Traoré of sabotaging international progress. In private, he pressed allies to sanction Burkina, Faso, Mali, and Ninja. He advised delivery corporations to blacklist Sahel ports, yet even those threats rang hollow. Too many eyes have been now looking. Too many Africans had visible the proof with their personal eyes. Traoré seized the moment. He convened a regional summit in Bamako, inviting leaders from the alliance of Sahel states and past. Cameras broadcast live as he declared, "We have shown the fraud. We have shown the chains hidden in remedy. Now we ought to act collectively alone. They punish us. Together they cannot contact us." The corridor erupted in applause. By the summit's end, a joint decision changed into past. Member states would assessment, suspend or cancel IMF offers containing resource collateral clauses. They pledged to explore nearby alternatives for financing, drawing hobby from partners in BRICS and the Gulf. The symbolism became as effective as the policy. For a long time, Africa's reaction to IMF dictates were fractured kingdom by kingdom. Now for the primary time, a bloc overtly rejected the phrases. The electricity coup changed into collapsing beneath the load of unity. On the floor, unity deepened. Communities tightened belts but did now not fracture. Farmers trucked grain across borders to ease shortages. Local radio hosts rallied listeners with the chorus, "Better to lose their loans than to lose our future." In Western capitals, confusion reigned. Analysts who as soon as praised IMF's initiative now warned of blowback. "We chance pushing Africa into rival structures." A London paper admitted. Investors in the back of the Phoenix dollar grew frightened. Without African commodities, the project lacked credibility. Quietly, some commenced to withdraw. Trump livid doubled down. He threatened price lists on African exports, known as for freezing African reserves in European banks. But each risk simplest hardened remedy. His words circulated on African social media with biting captions. "See, they do not forgive debts. They enslave futures." By the near of the YR, the IMF initiative lay in ruins. Contracts unraveled. The Phoenix dollar stalled, and Africa stood greater united than it had in a generation. Traor's gamble had paid off. He had not invented a brand new foreign money or raised substantial sums. He had done something a long way less complicated, and some distance greater powerful. He had told the fact and given the humans the documents to look it for themselves. What began as Trump's formidable plan to anchor his coin in Africa's assets ended as a public trial, in which Africa rendered its verdict guilty of economic colonization. The continent had stared into the trap and stepped again together. But Burkina Faso did not acquire billions in debt alleviation. No new credit score traces flowed into Ouagadougou. The ships wearing grain nonetheless arrived past due. The fee of gas nevertheless weighed heavy on households. On paper, it gave the impression of defeat, but in truth, something extra had been received. For the first time in a long time, Africans had stared at the first-class print and stated no. They had refused to change their kids' future for someone else's experiment, and that they had accomplished it not because an overseas power dictated it, however, due to the fact one in every of their very own leaders had dared to put the proof at the table. Ibrahim Traoré stood before the crowd in Bamako at the near of the Sahel summit. Flags of Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso fluttered collectively, their colorations mixing within the evening wind. His words had been measured, but his tone carried the weight of history. They thought our silence become lack of knowledge. The idea our hunger was weak spot. But starvation has not broken us. Silence has no longer blinded us. We have visible their contracts. We have read their lies. And these days, Africa cancels no longer simply their agreements, but the very concept that our resources are theirs to command. The crowd erupted. Farmers held up sheaves of grain. Miners lifted their helmets. Students waved their notebooks. It became not only a rally, it changed into an announcement. Around the continent, the instant resonated. In Senegal, a young woman advised a journalist, "For as soon as our leaders listen to us, now not to Washington." In Kinshasa, a miner whispered to his son, "Remember these days. It is the day we stated no, even abroad." Analysts conceded the shift. Africa has found its voice, one European columnist admitted, and it will now not effortlessly be silenced. The Phoenix greenback, as soon as touted as Trump's next tremendous play, turned into stalled. Investors pulled back without Africa's oil and gold. The coin had no anchor, no story, no destiny. But for Africans, the victory was by no means about crashing a foreign money test. It changed into about proving that harmony, transparency, and braveness ought to gain what guns and sanctions couldn't: dignity. Traoré closed his speech with a phrase that would be etched into banners and songs for years yet to come. "We did not ask for permission to be loose. We exposed the fact. We stood collectively, and in standing we gained." The crowd roared. Drums rolled within the streets of Ouagadougou, Niamey, Bamako, and past.